The day I buried my father, I wore his old flannel shirt because it was the only piece of him I had left. 6 months later, I found out I'd been wearing a dead man's shirt, and my father was very much alive, sitting in a concrete room 30 feet beneath the ground he'd spent 26 years protecting. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Regan Calloway. I'm 28 years old. I design buildings for a living, structures meant to stand, meant to last, meant to tell the truth about the ground they're built on. The irony isn't lost on me. I grew up believing my father chose to disappear. That one morning when I was 6 years old, Owen Calloway simply decided that whatever was out there in the world was worth more than the daughter he was leaving behind. My mother never explained it differently, and I stopped asking by the time I was 10. So when a lawyer called me on a Tuesday afternoon and told me Owen had died, that he'd left me 92 acres of land in a valley in Idaho I'd never heard of, I didn't cry. I just asked where to sign. What I didn't know was that the land wasn't the inheritance. The truth buried underneath it was. And it was going to change everything I thought I knew about my father, about loyalty, and about what a person will do and destroy to protect the ones they love from a distance. The day I buried my father, the sky over Portland was the kind of gray that doesn't commit to anything. Not quite rain, not quite clouds, just a flat, indifferent ceiling pressing down on the city like it had somewhere else to be. I wore his old flannel shirt to the service. Red and black plaid worn thin at the elbows, smelling faintly of machine oil, and something I couldn't name but had always associated with Saturday mornings when I was very small. It was the only thing of his I had kept, not because I was sentimental about it, but because when the hospice called and asked if there was anything I wanted before they cleared his room in Boise, I said no, and then drove 4 hours and changed my mind at the last minute, standing in the doorway of a room that still held the shape of a man I had never really known. The shirt was folded on the chair beside the window. I took it and left everything else. That was 6 months ago. My name is Regan Calloway. I am 28 years old. I design buildings, mostly commercial spaces, the occasional residential project for clients who have more money than they know what to do with. I am good at my work because I understand structure. I understand load-bearing walls and tension points and the invisible geometry that keeps things standing when everything around them wants to fall. I understand that what you see on the surface of a building is almost never the most important part. The most important part is always what's underneath. I did not understand this about people until much later. I grew up in Portland with my mother, Diane Calloway, who was a careful woman in the way that people become careful after they've been surprised badly once and decided never to let it happen again. She kept the house neat. She kept her feelings neater. She worked as a dental hygienist for 31 years, came home at the same time every evening, made dinner from a rotation of 7 reliable recipes, and never once spoke about my father in a way that invited follow-up questions. Owen Calloway left when I was 6 years old. That's the whole story as far as I was raised to understand it. He left. People leave. Life goes on. We don't talk about it. I stopped asking why by the time I was 10. By 14, I had decided he was a man who made a choice, and the choice wasn't me. And there was a certain clean freedom in accepting that and moving on. By 22, I had built enough of a life, enough forward momentum, enough professional identity, enough deliberate distance that the absence of a father felt like something that had happened to a different version of me. A younger, softer version I had mostly outgrown, or so I told myself. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I was alone in my apartment, which was how I preferred it, sitting at my drafting table with 3 hours of work still ahead of me and a cup of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours earlier. The building outside my window was wrapped in construction scaffolding, and workers in orange vests moved across the metal framework in the gray afternoon light like slow-moving birds on a wire. I watched them when I needed to think. My phone buzzed on the corner of the table, and I ignored it, assuming it was a client. Then it buzzed again immediately after, which was unusual. I picked it up. The caller ID read Siebel Crane and Associates Creston Valley ID. I didn't recognize the name. I almost didn't answer. I answered. The woman on the other end of the line had a voice like river gravel, low, unhurried, deliberate in a way that made you pay attention without quite knowing why. She introduced herself. She told me she was an attorney operating out of a small town in southern Idaho. She told me she was calling about my father. I felt the old familiar tightening in my chest, the one I'd spent years convincing myself I'd gotten rid of. Owen Calloway, she said in the careful way people say the names of the dead. He passed away 6 weeks ago. I'm very sorry for your loss. I said nothing for a moment. I wasn't aware he was sick, I said finally, which was true and also not quite the honest response to what she told me. The honest response would have required more vulnerability than I was willing to spend on a Tuesday afternoon with a stranger on the phone. He wasn't sick, she said. Oh, it was sudden. He went quietly, which I think is what he would have wanted. I looked at the construction workers outside my window. One of them was standing perfectly still on a platform 3 floors up, looking out at something I couldn't see from where I sat. Miss Calloway, Sybil Crane, said your father left you something. I assume that's why you were calling. 92 acres of farmland in Creston Valley, Idaho. A property called the Coldwell Farm. The title has been in your father's name for 26 years. I put my pen down on the drafting table slowly. That's not possible, I said. My father he didn't have anything. He worked construction most of his life. He rented a room in Boise. He did work construction, she agreed. Oh, and he did rent that room, but the land has been in his name since 1997, and the property taxes have been paid in full every single year without exception. The sound of the construction outside filled the silence between us. Metal on metal, the slow mechanical groan of something being lifted. There's more, Crane said. Of course there is, I said. She explained the terms of the will. The property was mine outright, free and clear. No mortgage, no liens, no complications of that kind. But the will contained a specific condition, a clause that my father had apparently been very insistent about. The language was direct. I was not to sell the property under any circumstances. And there was one additional instruction, unusual enough, that Sybil Crane read it aloud word for word. If anyone offers to purchase the property, go to the study on the main floor and open the 3rd drawer of the oak desk. I let that sit for a moment. That's an odd thing to put in a will, I said. Your father was a careful man, she replied. In my experience, careful men don't put things in wills without reasons. She told me she could meet me at the property the following week to hand over the keys and the relevant documents. She told me there was also a sealed envelope addressed to me in my father's handwriting that she had been instructed not to open or describe. Before she hung up, she said one more thing, quietly as if she was deciding as she spoke whether to say it at all. Miss Calloway, your undergraduate tuition, your graduate program at Pacific Northwest, all 4 years paid in full by an anonymous donor through a third-party educational trust. I went very still. That donor, she said, was your father. She ended the call before I could respond. I sat at my drafting table for a long time after that, looking at nothing in particular. The coffee was completely cold. Outside, the construction worker who had been standing still was gone. The platform was empty. I thought about the tuition, $46,000 a year for 4 years. More money than a man who rented a room in Boise and worked construction jobs should have had access to. I had spent 6 years of my adult life assuming I had earned my education on the back of student loans and scholarships and sheer grinding effort. I had built a professional identity around that story, around the idea that I had done it alone. That story apparently was not the whole story. I called my one close friend Petra, who told me to go. You don't have to forgive him, she said, but you have to go. You'll wonder forever if you don't. She was right, she usually was. I booked a rental car for the following Thursday. Barrett Holt called me the next morning. I had met Barrett twice, once at a school event when I was perhaps 7 or 8 years old, and once at the Boise hospice when I came to collect my father's things. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with a close-cropped gray beard and the kind of weathered hands that come from a lifetime of working with them. He had been my father's closest friend since the early 1990s or so. My mother had told me once, in one of her rare, unguarded moments when Owen's name came up and she forgot to be careful. He offered to drive me to Idaho. It's a long way to go alone, he said. And I know the roads. I used to make that drive a fair bit back when Owen and I were working together. I didn't particularly want company. But there was something disarming about Barrett Holt, a steadiness to him that made refusal feel unnecessarily cold. He had come to Boise when my father died. He had handled most of the arrangements. He had sent me a handwritten condolence card, which no one under the age of 70 did anymore. I told him he could drive. We left Portland on a Thursday morning before sunrise. The first few hours were quiet in the way that shared silences between near strangers can be not uncomfortable exactly but carefully maintained. Barrett drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio set low on a country station he didn't seem to be actively listening to. I watched eastern Oregon roll past the passenger window, the landscape flattening and drying as we moved inland, the trees thinning out until there was mostly just wide open sky and the occasional cluster of cattle standing at the edge of a field like they were thinking about something. We talked some. Barrett told me stories about my father, small ones, the kind that don't build to anything dramatic, just fill in the texture of a life. How Owen could fix any piece of machinery ever made given enough time and quiet. How he made terrible coffee but was so insistent on making it himself that people stopped pointing it out. How he once drove 4 hours in a snowstorm to help Barrett pull a truck out of a ditch and then turned around and drove 4 hours home without staying for dinner. I listened. I did not say much. Somewhere around noon, as we crossed into Idaho and the landscape began to rise and fold back into itself, hills appearing in the distance, the pale gold of autumn grass rippling across the slopes, I asked the question I'd been holding since the beginning of the drive. What do you know about the land? Barrett's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. Such a small thing, almost nothing. I noticed it. Not much, he said. No, Owen never talked about it. He never mentioned 92 acres of land to his closest friend. Owen kept things compartmentalized, Barrett said. It was just how he was. I looked at the road ahead and let it go. Creston Valley announced itself modestly, a water tower visible from the highway, a four-way stop with a gas station on one corner and a diner on another, then a stretch of county road that curved through low hills before depositing us onto a gravel lane with a rusted mailbox at the entrance and a hand-painted sign that read Coldwell. The letters faded to near illegibility. The farmhouse came into view at the end of the lane. It was older than I expected, 2 stories built from dark timber that had weathered to the color of old pewter. A covered porch ran the full length of the front, its floorboards warped in a way that made the whole structure look like it was slowly exhaling. Behind it, a large barn stood at a slight angle to the main building, not dangerously so, but visibly as if it had spent decades leaning into the prevailing wind and had simply stopped fighting it. Beyond the barn, the land opened up. I stepped out of the car and stood in the gravel and looked at it. The afternoon light was coming in at a low angle, painting everything amber and rust, and the field stretched away from the house in long, slow waves of dry grass that moved in the wind, the way water moves with a kind of patience that made you understand why people spent whole lives trying to hold on to pieces of ground like this. 92 acres. My father had owned this for 26 years and never once mentioned it. Sybil Crane was waiting for us on the porch. She was smaller than her voice had suggested. A compact woman in her early 50s with iron gray hair pulled back from her face, and sharp dark eyes that evaluated you quickly and quietly and filed away what they found. She wore a good coat and sensible boots and carried a leather briefcase that looked like it had been used daily for at least a decade. She shook my hand with a firm, dry grip. She shook Barrett's hand, and I watched his face for something I wasn't sure what, but he was neutral and pleasant and gave me nothing. We went inside. The interior of the farmhouse smelled of cedar and cold stone, and something else I couldn't immediately identify, something faint and familiar that sat at the edge of memory without quite resolving into a specific image. The furniture was sparse but solid: a kitchen table and 4 chairs, a sofa in the front room with a wool blanket folded over the arm, bookshelves along the far wall half filled with paperback novels and geology texts and what looked like 20 years of accumulated field and stream magazines. Sybil led us to the study. It was a small room off the main hallway, lined with filing cabinets and a workbench that ran the length of one wall. On the workbench were topographical maps, some rolled and some weighted flat at the corners with river stones. And in the center of the room stood a heavy oak desk, its surface clear except for a brass lamp and a small framed photograph turned face down. I noticed the photograph. I didn't touch it. Sybil opened her briefcase and set the documents on the desk in a careful stack. Deed of title, tax records going back to 1997, every year paid, every year on time. The will itself, 4 pages, the signature at the bottom in the same careful, slightly left-leaning hand I had spent one afternoon at the hospice recognizing from a birthday card I found in the drawer of his nightstand, the only card he had ever sent me, postmarked on my 16th birthday, the year after I stopped asking about him. It just said, "I think about you every day. I'm sorry I can't explain yet. Dad." I had thrown it away, then retrieved it from the trash, then thrown it away again. I read the will. The language was clear. The property was mine. The condition was clear. No sale under any circumstances. And the instruction was there exactly as Sybil had read it on the phone. If anyone offers to purchase, go to the study. Open the 3rd drawer of the oak desk. The sealed envelope, I said. Sybil reached into her briefcase and set it on the desk in front of me. A standard white envelope sealed with what looked like wax and then taped over. My name on the front in my father's handwriting. Just Regan. He gave me that 8 months ago, Sybil said. I looked up at her. 8 months ago he was still alive, I said. Yes, she said simply. I understood she wasn't going to say anything more about that. Not yet, and possibly not ever, depending on what I did next. I put the envelope in the inside pocket of my jacket. Barrett was standing near the doorway of the study, and I saw him watch me do it. A quick involuntary glance, barely a second before his eyes moved away to the bookshelves. We were wrapping up the formalities when we heard tires on gravel. All 3 of us heard it. The sound carried through the still afternoon air with the particular clarity of things happening in quiet places out here where there was no traffic noise, no ambient city hum. To absorb it, every sound announced itself fully and waited to be acknowledged. I went to the window. A black Range Rover had pulled into the gravel yard and stopped. The man who stepped out of it looked at first glance like someone who had arrived at the wrong property. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with silver hair cut close to his head, and the kind of erect posture that comes either from military background or a lifetime of believing your presence commands a room. He wore a dark overcoat that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he walked toward the porch with the measured, unhurried stride of a man who has never once in his adult life had to hurry for anything. Sybil went very still beside me, just for a moment, half a breath, then she was composed again. I went to the front door and opened it before he reached the porch. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at me with pale blue eyes that were completely professionally pleasant. "You must be Regan Calloway," he said. "I'd know Owen's daughter anywhere. The same eyes." "I don't know your eyes," I said, "or your name." A small, controlled smile. "Richard Voss. I run Voss Energy Partners out of Denver." I apologized for arriving unannounced. I heard through the county office that the property had transferred, and I wanted to introduce myself in person before too much time passed. He paused as if what he was about to say was an afterthought rather than the entire reason he was standing in the gravel. I've been trying to purchase this land for a number of years. I'd like to make you an offer if you're open to it. How did you know I'd be here today? I asked. The smile stayed exactly where it was. Small county, he said. People talk. He reached into his coat and produced a business card and a folded piece of paper which he held out toward me. I stepped down and took both. The card was heavy stock embossed, the kind that costs $1 each to print. The piece of paper was a written offer formal, specific, signed $800,000 cash for 92 acres of farmland in Creston Valley, Idaho. I had looked up comparable properties on the drive down. The land was worth $300,000 on a good day. I folded the paper carefully along its existing crease and held it. I'll need time to consider, I said. Voss nodded as if this was exactly what he'd expected and was entirely fine with it, which somehow made it worse. Of course, he said, but I'd encourage you not to take too long. These situations have a way of becoming complicated when they're left unresolved. He glanced past me briefly toward the door of the farmhouse. Is Barrett here with you? I didn't answer immediately. You know Barrett Holt. We've crossed paths, he said with the same controlled pleasantness. Please give him my regards. He turned and walked back to the Range Rover. No hurry, no second glances. He drove out the gravel lane at the same unhurried pace he'd arrived. I stood on the porch steps and held the folded offer and watched the dust settle. Behind me, the screen door opened and Barrett stepped out. That was Richard Voss, I said, without turning around. I know who it was, Barrett said. He asked me to give you his regards. Barrett said nothing. I turned and looked at him, and he was watching the lane where the Range Rover had gone, and his face had the careful blankness of a man maintaining a version of himself that requires effort. You've met him before, I said, and a long time ago, he said, through your father. It's a small world in land development. I looked at him for a moment. He looked back. He had the kind of face that was very good at presenting exactly as much as it chose to present. I went back inside. That night after a dinner, neither of us put much effort into. Barrett settled on the sofa with a paperback he'd brought from the car, and I told him I was going to turn in early. He nodded without looking up. I climbed the stairs to the room I'd chosen, the second door on the right, a narrow room with a window that faced the barn and the fields beyond it. I lay on the bed in the dark for a while with my jacket still on. Then I got up and locked the door. I took the envelope from my inside pocket and set it on the small table by the window. The wax seal caught what little moonlight came through the glass. My name in my father's handwriting. Just Regan. I opened it. Inside, a hand-drawn map of the property and the surrounding terrain rendered in careful pencil with elevation lines and compass bearings, and a level of geographic detail that spoke to someone who understood land the way an architect understands a building, not just the surface but the layers beneath it. And behind the map, folded separately, a chiaqua, an iron key, old and heavy, its surface rough with what looked like decades of oxidation. And behind the key, a single sheet of paper, my father's handwriting, dated March of that year, 7 months ago. I read it slowly. He wrote that he couldn't explain everything in a letter. He wrote that he was sorry for things he was not yet able to say in person. He wrote that the land mattered more than I could understand yet, and that the reasons for the will's conditions would become clear if I followed the map. And then at the bottom of the page, in writing that pressed harder into the paper than everything above it, as if the act of writing it required more force than everything else combined. Do not let Barrett see this map. He is not who you think he is. Find the stone well behind the barn. Use the key. Come down alone. I am waiting for you. I read those last 4 sentences 3 times. Outside the window, the barn stood black against the sky. Beyond it, the fields lay silver and still in the moonlight. Somewhere out there behind that barn was a stone well marked on a hand-drawn map by a man who had been dead for 6 weeks. A man who had written this letter 7 months ago, a man who had told me he was waiting. I sat by that window for a long time. The iron key was cold in my palm. The map was spread across my knees. I thought about everything I knew about Owen Calloway, which was almost nothing. I thought about the flannel shirt I had driven 4 hours to collect from a hospice room. I thought about a birthday card postmarked the year I was 16, the card I had thrown away and retrieved and thrown away again. I thought about $46,000 a year paid in secret by a man who rented a room in Boise and apparently owned 92 acres in Idaho that someone from Denver was willing to pay nearly 3 times market value to acquire. I thought about Barrett Holt's hands tightening on the steering wheel when I asked him what he knew about the land. I thought about Richard Voss asking if Barrett was here before he'd even been introduced to the inside of the house. I am waiting for you. I was trained to understand structures, to read the geometry of things, to look at a surface and understand what was underneath it. I had spent a decade building a professional identity around that skill. My father had spent 26 years building something beneath his ground, and he had left me the key. I put on my boots. I put the map in my jacket pocket and the iron key in my right hand. I looked at the locked door of the room for a moment, then I went to the window. The drop from the sill to the porch roof was manageable. From the porch roof to the ground was less than 10 feet, with the wood pile stacked against the wall below, offering a natural stepping point. I had assessed worse structures than this. I came down quietly. The night air was cold and sharp, with the smell of dry grass and pine resin and the particular mineral stillness of open land in autumn. The moon was high and nearly full, which I was grateful for. I crossed the yard to the barn, moving along the edge of the shadow cast by the building, and rounded the far corner. The stone well was there. It was older than the barn, possibly older than the farmhouse itself. The stones were river granite, fitted without mortar, in the old way, rising about 3 feet above the ground and capped with a wooden cover that had been replaced recently. The wood was newer than the rest, pale and unstained, sitting too cleanly on the old stones. Beside it, nearly hidden by the long grass, were the remains of a pulley frame, its rope long rotted away. I stood at the edge and listened to the night. Then I gripped the wooden cover and pulled it aside. No sound of water, no smell of water. Instead, as I leaned over the rim with the small flashlight from my jacket pocket, the beam caught the rungs of an iron ladder bolted directly into the stone, descending into darkness. Wells don't have iron ladders. I gripped the first rung with my right hand. The metal was cold and solid and slightly rough with rust that had been wire brushed down to a manageable texture, recently maintained, not abandoned. Someone had been taking care of this. I started climbing down. The stone walls of the well gave way about 15 feet down to poured concrete, smooth gray, clearly modern construction hidden beneath the original stonework. The ladder continued. The air grew cooler, drier, carrying that faint mineral quality of deep earth. At 25 feet, my boots found solid ground, a concrete floor level and clean. The flashlight beam moved through the darkness ahead of me. A tunnel, roughly 5 feet wide and 6 feet high, with timber supports every 8 feet along the walls and a single run of electrical conduit along the ceiling, its cable worn but intact. The floor was level, the air was still, the tunnel ran straight ahead into the dark for as far as the flashlight would reach. I stood at the bottom of the ladder and listened to the silence for a long moment. Then from somewhere ahead of me, muffled, distant, unmistakable, came the sound of a single cough. My flashlight hand was steady. My breathing was not. I walked forward. The tunnel ran approximately 40 feet before ending at a steel door set flush into a concrete wall. The door was old surface, rusted, with a heavy lever handle and a single keyhole. The lock was a different story. It was newer than the door, a solid brass mechanism that had been installed into the older steel, and it was clean and oiled and clearly in regular use. The iron key was in my right hand. I stood in front of that door for what might have been 10 seconds or might have been 2 minutes. I am an architect. I understand the relationship between doors and what they contain. I understand that some thresholds, once crossed, reorganize everything on either side of them. I put the key in the lock. It turned with a single clean click. I pushed the door open. The room on the other side was perhaps 12 feet square. Concrete walls, concrete floor. A folding table against the far wall stacked with equipment I didn't immediately recognize in the dim light, recording devices it looked like, and a shortwave radio. Shelves with canned food and water containers and paperback books and a battery-powered lamp that glowed amber and low. A narrow military surplus cot against the right wall with a wool blanket folded at the foot. And on the cot, sitting upright, shielding his eyes from the flashlight beam with one raised hand, a man. Thinner than I remembered from the hospice photograph I had seen in the administrator's office. Gray-haired, wearing a flannel shirt nearly identical to the one I had taken from his room. The scar above his right eyebrow that I recognized from a photograph my mother had kept in a box in the hall closet and thought I didn't know about. He lowered his hand from his eyes and looked at me. Owen Calloway looked at his daughter for the first time in 22 years. His voice, when it came, was rough from disuse, quiet but steady. "Reagan," he said. The word fell into the underground silence like a stone into water. I felt the ripples move through my chest before I felt anything else, before the anger, before the questions, before the 22 years of accumulated absence demanded their accounting. There was just that. My name in my father's voice in a concrete room beneath the earth when I had stood 6 weeks ago at a graveside in Boise and watched them lower a casket into the ground. I didn't speak for a long time. When I finally did, I asked the only question that seemed to matter right then. Not who was in the coffin, not how this was possible, not why, not the 22 years, just this: "How long have you been down here?" 4 months, he said. "And then I need to tell you something about this land, about what's under it, about why Richard has been trying to take it for 26 years. He stood slowly, steadying himself on the edge of the cot, and looked at me across the small underground room with an expression I had no prior reference point for, because I had not known him well enough for long enough to have a catalogue of his expressions. But I recognized it anyway. It was the face of a man who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has finally, at great cost, and with great care, found the person he was willing to hand it to. "Sit down," he said. "There's a lot I have to explain before morning." I pulled the flashlight back so it wasn't in his eyes anymore, and I sat down. He looked older than I had expected. That was the first coherent thought that assembled itself in my mind after the initial shock began to settle, not fully, not cleanly, but enough that I could observe specific things rather than just absorbing the impossible whole of the situation. He looked older than the man in the administrator's photograph at the Boise hospice, older than the man my mother had described in her rare, careful references. The 4 months underground had taken something from him, not his steadiness, not his clarity, but some surface layer of resilience that people carry without knowing it, the kind that comes from sunlight and open air and the simple physical fact of being above ground. He sat across from me on the folding chair he had pulled from beside the table. I was on the cot. The amber light from the battery lamp sat between us on the concrete floor and threw shadows upward across both our faces in a way that made the conversation feel more like something that was happening inside a dream than outside one. He did not apologize immediately. I noticed that. He did not begin with "I'm sorry" or "I know this is a shock" or "I can explain everything." He began the way a man begins when he has rehearsed a conversation for months, and has decided that the most respectful thing he can offer is the truth delivered straight without the softening that would make it easier on him but harder on the person receiving it. He began with the land. In 1996, Owen Calloway was 38 years old and working as a field geologist for a small independent survey company based out of Missoula, Montana. The company had been contracted to conduct a subsurface assessment of the Creston Valley Basin standard work, the kind that gets done quietly before land investment decisions are made. The team was 4 people. Owen was the lead. They spent 11 weeks in the valley drilling core samples, running electromagnetic surveys, mapping the subsurface geology in detail that no one had attempted in that particular stretch of southern Idaho before. What they found was not what they had been hired to look for. Beneath the Creston Valley Basin, at a depth of between 40 and 90 feet, ran a mineral deposit of an unusual concentration and extent: lithium, cobalt, trace elements of rare earth materials that in 1996 were considered commercially marginal, but by the mid-2000s had become among the most strategically valuable substances on Earth, driven by the explosion in battery technology and the global pivot toward electric vehicles and grid-scale energy storage. In 1996, Owen's team understood they had found something significant. They did not yet understand how significant. The survey company's primary investor, the man who had funded the Creston Valley contract and several others like it across the Intermountain West, was a Denver-based energy developer named Richard Voss. He was 40 years old in 1996. He had made his first fortune in natural gas and was methodically positioning himself for what he believed would be a coming shift in the energy landscape. He had hired the survey company specifically because independent contractors were less likely to generate the kind of paper trail that larger institutional players would create. When Owen's team submitted their findings, Voss moved quickly. Within 3 months, he had purchased or optioned nearly every parcel of land in the Creston Valley Basin. Ranches, timber parcels, and old mining claim from the 1940s that had never been formally abandoned. He was systematic and he was quiet and he was very effective. Most of the landowners in the valley had no idea why a Denver energy company was suddenly interested in their properties, and the offers were fair enough that they didn't ask too many questions. There was one parcel he could not acquire: the Caldwell Farm, 92 acres, at the geographic center of the valley basin, the only parcel that sat directly above the highest concentration portion of the deposit. Without it, access to the most valuable section of the mineral deposit was technically possible, but commercially impractical. The engineering required to reach it from any other angle would have multiplied the extraction cost by a factor that eliminated the economic case entirely. The owner of the Caldwell farm in 1996 was an elderly widow named Frances Caldwell, who had lived there for 50 years and had no interest in selling to anyone for any price. She died in the spring of 1997. She had no children. Her estate passed to a distant nephew in Pennsylvania who had never visited Idaho and accepted the first reasonable offer he received. Owen Calloway made that offer. He had no money. He had a field geologist's salary and a rented apartment in Missoula and a 6-year-old daughter in Portland, whom he was already failing in the ordinary daily ways that precede the larger failure that was coming. But he had something more useful than money in that particular moment. He had the geological survey data. He had the core samples. He had 11 weeks of fieldwork that documented exactly what was under that ground. And he had understood in the months between submitting the survey and watching Voss quietly absorb the valley around him that Voss intended to use that data without compensating the team that had produced it. That he intended to file the survey results under proprietary investment research, dismiss the survey company, and proceed as if the discovery had been his own. which is precisely what Voss did in early 1997. The survey company was dissolved. Owen and his 3 colleagues received their final paychecks, and a non-disclosure agreement that the lawyer Voss employed had constructed specifically to prevent them from discussing the Creston Valley findings with anyone. The other 3 signed it. Owen signed it. And then Owen did the one thing that changed the trajectory of the next 26 years. He used the money he had borrowed against his retirement account, $14,000, which was everything, and bought the Coldwell farm before Voss knew it had come available. He paid the nephew in Pennsylvania the asking price and a bit more to move quickly, and he had the title transferred and recorded before Voss's agents in the county had processed the death notice in their monitoring systems. It was a narrow window, 3 weeks, perhaps 4. Owen hit it exactly. When Voss found out, he was not immediately concerned. He made Owen an offer. Owen declined. Voss made a larger offer. Owen declined again. This happened 4 times over the following 2 years, the offers growing in size and in the implicit weight behind them, and each time Owen declined. After the 4th refusal, the offer stopped. Other things started. Owen described this period with the careful economy of a man who has lived with something so long it has lost its capacity to shock him, but not its capacity to exhaust him. Vehicles parked at the end of the farm lane for hours at a time. Mail opened and resealed. A break-in at his apartment in Missoula. Nothing taken, nothing visibly disturbed, but the specific arrangement of things on his desk, disrupted in a way that told him someone had been through his files. A conversation with the county assessor, who mentioned in a tone that was almost friendly that properties with irregular survey histories sometimes attracted complications that their owners hadn't anticipated. Owen left Missoula. He moved to Boise. He took a construction work under a different name. He paid the farm's property taxes through a trust account that Sybil Crane, then a junior attorney in Creston Valley who had handled the original title transfer, maintained on his behalf. He did not contact his daughter. This was the part I had been waiting for. I had sat through the geological history and the business history and the account of Voss's methodology with the focused attention I gave to complex structural problems at work, categorizing information, identifying load-bearing facts, mapping the architecture of what I was being told. But underneath all of it, steady and insistent as a current beneath still water, was the question I had been carrying for 22 years. Why did you leave? Owen looked at me when he reached this part of the story. He didn't look away, which I noted and which cost him something. I could see that even now. He said, Voss knew about you by 2002. Someone he employed found your mother's address. I found out because Sybil had a contact in the county who warned her. The message was indirect but not ambiguous. If I continued to refuse, the people I cared about would experience difficulties. Difficulties, I said. That was the word used. And you decided the solution was to disappear. I decided the solution was to make sure there was nothing connecting you to me that Voss could use. No relationship, no contact, no visible thread. He paused. If there's no father, there's no leverage. If you don't know about the land, you can't be pressured about the land. You could have told me, I said, when I was older, when I was an adult. I thought about it every year, he said, and every year the calculus was the same. You had built a life, a good one from what I could see. Bringing you into this meant bringing you into the danger. I had made a choice about that land. I didn't have the right to make that choice for you as well. I looked at the concrete wall behind his head for a moment, at the rough texture of it, the faint aggregate pattern in the poured surface. The tuition, I said. Something shifted in his face, subtle. You needed to build something real, he said. Something of your own. I could do that much without creating a connection Voss could find. I didn't say anything for a while. The amber lamp hummed faintly between us. Somewhere in the tunnel behind me, the silence had its own quality, dense and layered, the silence of deep earth, of geological time, of things that have been underground long enough to become part of the structure of the world. Tell me about the key, I said finally. Tell me about why now. Owen leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped and told me about the last 12 months. Voss had changed his approach. After 26 years of intermittent pressure, he had shifted from coercion to legal architecture. His attorneys had constructed a claim, a fraudulent one built on a contract that had been fabricated retroactively, asserting that a mineral rights agreement had been signed between Owen and Voss Energy Partners in 1997 prior to the Coldwell Farm purchase. The document bore Owen's signature or something close enough to it that distinguishing the forgery required a forensic document examiner who knew specifically what to look for. There was one forensic tell that Voss's forgers had missed. Owen was left-handed, had been his entire life. The signature on the fabricated 1997 contract showed the subtle wrist angle and pen pressure distribution of a right-handed writer, but proving that in court required time, resources, and a paper trail that could survive Voss's legal team. Early in 2023, Barrett Holt had called Owen. This was the part of the story that had been sitting in my chest since I'd read my father's letter upstairs in the farmhouse. I had been waiting for it without quite letting myself know I was waiting. Owen's voice, when he reached this section, took on a different register. Quieter, more careful with its words, the way you are careful with something that is both painful and not simple. Barrett had been Owen's friend since the early 1990s. They had met on a construction crew in Missoula the year before Owen's geological work in Creston Valley began. Barrett was smart, loyal, funny in the dry, undemonstrative way of men who grew up in places where humor was considered a private matter. He had been the best man at Owen's brief and disastrous first marriage. He had been the person Owen called the night he understood that Voss was going to make his life complicated in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. For 15 years, Owen had trusted Barrett Holt with everything. In 2022, Barrett's daughter Nora was diagnosed with thyroid cancer, stage 3. She was 23 years old. The treatment options were significant, aggressive, and expensive in a way that private insurance covered partially and insufficiently, and that Barrett's savings, which were those of a man who had worked construction and odd jobs his entire adult life, could not approach covering. By the fall of 2022, Barrett owed $380,000 to a hospital system in Spokane, with more accumulating monthly. Voss's people found Barrett in October of 2022. Owen did not know the specific mechanism, whether they had been monitoring Barrett as a known associate for years or whether someone inside the hospital's billing system had flagged the name. The result was the same. A representative of Voss Energy Partners approached Barrett with a proposal. In exchange for information about Owen, his location, his routines, the contents of any communications he received, the outstanding medical bills would be paid, and a trust established for Nora's ongoing care. Barrett accepted. For 5 months, he passed information to Voss's people. Not everything, not enough Owen believed to constitute a true betrayal of the kind that gets people killed, but enough. Enough to confirm that Owen was alive and in Boise, enough to describe the trust structure Sybil managed and the pattern of the tax payments, enough to establish beyond the question Voss had apparently been carrying for years, that the old geologist who had outmaneuvered him in 1997 was still out there and still holding. In March of 2023, Barrett overheard something he wasn't meant to hear. He had been meeting with Voss's intermediary in a parking structure in Boise. These meetings happened in person in locations chosen by Voss's people with no phones. Barrett had arrived early and was sitting in his truck when the intermediary arrived on a call, not yet aware Barrett was there, speaking in the flat, efficient language of men who are discussing logistics rather than morality. The phrase Barrett caught, and this was exact because he had repeated it to himself for hours afterward to be certain he had heard correctly, was before the summer. Clean. No connection to the property transfer. Barrett sat in his truck in the parking structure for 20 minutes after the call ended. Then he drove to a drugstore, bought a cheap notepad and an envelope and a stamp, and wrote 3 sentences in handwriting he deliberately roughened to be unrecognizable. He mailed it to a post office box in Creston Valley that Owen had given him years earlier for emergencies and instructed him never to use unless everything else had failed. The note said, "They're moving before summer, get out and stay out, burn this." Owen received it in the second week of March. He spent 6 weeks planning. He contacted Sibyl. He found Walter Grimes, a 61-year-old former mining contractor who had died without family at a Boise care facility. In early May, his remains unclaimed, his file flagged for county disposition. Owen had known Grimes peripherally from construction work years before. The physical similarities were approximate rather than exact, but approximate was sufficient for a closed casket service arranged quickly in grief, in a city where Owen had lived quietly and without deep community ties. The service was held in June. Barrett attended. He stood beside me at the graveside. He put his hand on my shoulder while the priest finished the prayer. He had known standing there that the casket was not Owen. I sat with that for a moment, with a specific image of it. Barrett's hand on my shoulder, the weight of it, the particular comfort I had taken from it in those first raw hours of a grief that had been complicated to begin with, because grieving a father you barely knew requires a different and more exhausting kind of emotional navigation than grieving one you were close to. He knew the whole time, I said, yes, and he came with me anyway. He drove me here. Owen looked at his hands. "I don't know what Barrett is doing right now," he said. "I don't know if Voss got to him again after the funeral. I don't know what he's told them since March, or whether the fact that he warned me is something he's been able to keep to himself." He looked up. "What I know is that there's a note in the letter I left you, and if you followed the instruction in that note, you came down here alone. Which means either Barrett doesn't know about the well, or he chose not to follow you." "He was reading on the sofa when I came down the window," I said. Owen nodded slowly. "The note he sent me," he said. "I recognize his handwriting despite the roughening. He thought he was disguising it. He wasn't." He paused. "That's either the action of a man who realized what he'd done and tried to correct it, or the action of a man playing a longer game. I have not been able to determine which with certainty, which is why I told you not to trust him." I stood up from the cot and walked the 3 steps to the concrete wall and stood with my back to it, looking at the room, at the recording equipment on the table, at the shortwave radio, at the careful functional organization of a small space occupied by someone who had learned to live efficiently within severe constraints. "What's all of that?" I said, nodding toward the table. Owen glanced at it. "For the past 4 months," he said, "I have been listening to Richard Voss communicate with his attorneys, his intermediaries, and his geological contractors." I looked at him. "Barrett's phone," Owen said. "I installed a passive audio relay on it in February before I disappeared, before he knew I was planning to disappear. It transmits to the receiver on that table. I've been recording everything." He had 4 months of recordings. He walked me through what was on them, speaking with the methodical precision of someone who has catalogued information carefully over a long period of time. Voss coordinating with his attorneys on the fraudulent 1997 contract. Voss discussing the timeline for filing the legal claim against the Caldwell farm. Voss's geological contractors confirming in a conversation they clearly believed was private that the lithium and cobalt deposit under the property had been independently reassessed in 2021 and estimated at between $4 and $7 billion in extractable value at current market prices. $4 to $7 billion beneath 92 acres of farmland in southern Idaho that my father had bought for $14,000 borrowed against a retirement account he had never recovered. And there was one more recording, the most recent, 3 days before Sybil Crane had called me in Portland. Voss and his senior attorney discussing the inheritance transfer, discussing me specifically, my name, my profession, my address in Seattle, discussing the approach they intended to take. The attorney's phrase on the recording was, "The daughter won't have the context to resist. Make the offer large enough that refusing feels irrational. If she resists, apply the legal mechanism. If the legal mechanism is contested, we move to the secondary option." Owen did not explain what the secondary option was. He didn't need to. I pressed my palms flat against the concrete wall behind me and felt the cold of the deep earth coming through it. The mineral stillness, the geological patience of it. I thought about load-bearing walls, about the invisible architecture that keeps things standing, about what happens when you remove a single structural element that everything else depends on. "Sybil," I said, "tell me about Sybil." Owen's expression shifted in a way I hadn't seen yet, something that might have been relief, or the nearest thing to it that a man allows himself when he has been alone with something difficult for a very long time. Sybil Crane had not always been a small-town attorney in Creston Valley, Idaho. For 12 years, from 1997 to 2009, she had been the director of legal affairs for Voss Energy Partners. She had been in that role when the Creston Valley survey data was filed as proprietary research. She had been in that role when the non-disclosure agreements were drafted and distributed to Owen's team. She had reviewed the documentation. She had signed off on the corporate structure that absorbed the geological findings and erased the team that had produced them. She had not forged anything herself, and she had not directly directed the more coercive elements of Voss's approach to the Caldwell farm over the following years. But she had known with the specific and detailed knowledge of a senior attorney whose job is to understand exactly what she is facilitating. In 2009, she left Voss Energy Partners. She never said publicly why. She took a significant reduction in salary, moved to Creston Valley, the small Idaho town where all of this had begun, and opened a general practice, wills, property transfers, estate planning, the ordinary legal needs of ordinary people in a rural county. She had handled the original title transfer of the Caldwell farm in 1997. That was how Owen had found her again years later. He needed an attorney he could trust with the property tax trust, and he had reasoned correctly, as it turned out, that a woman who had left a lucrative position with Voss Energy and moved to the exact valley where the original wrong had been committed might be carrying the particular kind of guilt that translates into a long-term commitment to correction. He had been right. Sybil had been building a case for 4 years. She had documented the fraudulent contract. She had reconstructed the chain of custody of the 1997 geological survey data. She had connected Voss Energy's land acquisitions in the Creston Valley Basin to the specific subsurface mineral mapping that Owen's team had produced, demonstrating through public filing records and cross-referenced survey data that the correlation was not coincidental. She had identified 3 other instances of similar operations in different states, each following the same pattern: an independent survey team, a dominant investor, a dissolution of the contracting company, a systematic acquisition of the relevant land. 2 weeks before Sybil called me in Portland, she had submitted a sealed evidentiary package to the FBI's Denver field office. The agent handling the file had told her they were ready to proceed. What they needed was a triggering event, a documented witness instance of Voss taking action in furtherance of the existing scheme. His appearance at the Caldwell farm, his presentation of the fraudulent contract, his offer, and the implicit threat behind it all of it recorded or witnessed would complete the evidentiary picture. Sybil had called me because Owen had asked her to. Because the triggering event required someone to be at the farm, someone with a legal right to be there, someone Voss would come to when he learned the property had transferred. Owen had been counting on the fact that Voss would arrive quickly. He knew the man. 26 years of knowing an adversary gives you a reliable model of how they move. Voss had arrived on the first day. He had presented the offer and the implicit deadline. Sybil had been present. I had held the offer in my hand. And somewhere above us right now, in the farmhouse or on the lane outside it, the machinery that Owen had spent 4 months building from a concrete room 30 feet underground was completing its first full rotation. I had been standing against the wall for a long time without speaking. Owen was watching me with the careful attention of a man who understands he has no right to rush the person across from him. I pushed off the wall and came back to the center of the room. "What happens now?" I said it. "Now," Owen said, "depends on what Barrett does." As if the sentence itself had been a cue, as if the underground room had its own acoustics, its own relationship with what was happening on the surface above it. We both heard it at the same moment. Tires on gravel, not one vehicle, two. Owen was on his feet before I'd fully processed the sound. He moved to the table and checked the recording equipment with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this check many times, a quick visual confirmation that the device was active and logging. Then he turned and looked at me with an expression that had shed everything extraneous and arrived at something very clear. "They're here," he said. I thought about Barrett on the sofa with his paperback, about the way he'd watched me pocket the sealed envelope in the study, about his hands on the steering wheel when I asked about the land, about Voss asking for him by name before he'd been invited inside. And I thought about a man in a parking structure in Boise, arriving early, sitting in his truck, hearing 3 words he wasn't meant to hear, and spending 20 minutes deciding what to do with them. Before summer, clean, no connection to the property transfer. I thought about what it costs a person to betray someone they love when the thing they love most is dying and they can't find another way to save her. And then I thought about what it costs a person to correct that betrayal when the opportunity finally arrives and the cost of correction is everything they have left. I looked at my father in the amber light of the underground room. "I'm going up first," I said. He started to speak. I held up one hand. "I'm the legal owner of this property," I said. "I'm the one who has standing here. You're supposed to be dead, which means the moment you appear, everything changes. Let me go up first." I paused. "And stay close to the ladder." Owen Calloway looked at his daughter for a long moment, then he nodded. I turned and walked back through the tunnel toward the iron ladder, the flashlight beam moving ahead of me through the underground dark. Behind me I heard Owen follow at a measured distance, and the sound of his footsteps on the concrete floor had the same careful, deliberate quality as everything else about him, a man who moves through the world with full attention to what he's doing and why. At the base of the ladder I stopped and listened. Above me, through 30 feet of earth and stone, the faint sound of voices in the yard. One of them was Barrett's. I gripped the first rung and began to climb. The night air hit me like cold water. I came up out of the well in one continuous movement, hands on the stone rim, boots finding purchase on the lip, and stood upright in the dark field behind the barn before I had fully decided to do any of it. The body sometimes moves before the mind grants permission. This was one of those moments. I stood still and let my eyes adjust. The moon was still high, still full, still casting that silver flatness across the fields that made everything look like a photograph of itself rather than the thing itself. The barn was a black wall to my left. The farmhouse was visible beyond it, light coming from the front windows, and in the gravel yard between the barn and the house, two vehicles were parked at angles that suggested arrival rather than intention to stay. Barrett's truck and the black Range Rover. I could hear voices from the yard, but not yet make out words. Two voices, Barrett's familiar register and one other lower, more controlled. I pulled the wooden cover back over the well opening, not for concealment, just to buy Owen the few seconds of warning the sound would provide if anyone came around the barn before I was ready. I moved along the shadow line of the barn wall toward the corner and stopped there. From this angle, I could see the yard clearly. Barrett was standing near his truck with his hands in his jacket pockets in the posture of a man who wants to appear relaxed and is not achieving it. Richard Voss was standing 6 feet away from him near the porch steps, and even in the moonlight, the difference between them was legible. Voss, composed and still in the way of a man for whom patience is a professional tool. Barrett moving his weight slightly from foot to foot in the way of a man for whom patience has run out. A third figure stood near the Range Rover, larger, younger, saying nothing, not a lawyer. I noted the third figure and filed it. I stepped out from the shadow of the barn into the moonlight. Barrett saw me first. His head came up and his expression did something complicated in the half second before he controlled it, relief and dread arriving simultaneously, which is a difficult combination to conceal on a human face, particularly when you are not expecting the face you're looking at. Voss turned a bit later, more measured. He had the practiced self-possession of a man who has spent 65 years ensuring that nothing happening around him appears to surprise him. But his eyes moved over me quickly, checking for something, assessing something before settling into their professional pleasantness. "Miss Calloway," he said, "I apologize for the hour. I was hoping to speak with Barrett privately, and I understood he was staying at the property." "You drove from Denver at 2 in the morning to speak with Barrett privately," I said. A small pause, almost imperceptible. "I've been in the area." "Mr. Voss?" I kept my voice level the way I kept my voice level in contractor meetings when someone was telling me a structural calculation was fine and I knew it wasn't. "You're on my property at 2 in the morning. I'd like you to tell me why." He studied me for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and produced a document, a different one from the offer he had brought this afternoon. This one was thicker, held together with a binder clip, the pages dense with legal formatting visible even at 10 feet in the moonlight. "This is a court order," he said, "filed in Blaine County this week. It affirms a prior mineral rights agreement between your father and Voss partners dated March 1997. As a result, the mineral extraction rights to the subsurface of this property legally transferred to my company 26 years ago, regardless of the surface title. You own the land. We own what's under it." He held the document toward me. I walked forward and took it. I stood in the gravel yard in the moonlight and read it with the same focused attention I gave to building specifications, looking not for the overall picture, but for the specific details that don't align, the joints that don't connect cleanly, the places where something has been made to look structurally sound that isn't. It took me about 90 seconds. I looked up. "This agreement is signed by Owen Calloway," I said. "That's correct?" My father was left-handed his entire life. I held the document up slightly, angling it toward the moonlight. "The signature on this document was made by someone who holds a pen in their right hand. The wrist angle is wrong. The pressure distribution across the letter forms is wrong. I'm an architect, Mr. Voss. I spent my professional life reading the physical evidence of how structures were built." This signature was not made by my father. The silence in the yard had a particular quality, the kind that exists between the moment structural failure begins and the moment it becomes audible. Voss's expression did not change. That was the thing about him. The control was very deep, very practiced, the product of a lifetime of situations in which maintaining the surface was the primary objective. But something behind his eyes shifted, a recalibration, the kind that happens when a plan encounters a variable it didn't account for. That's a serious allegation, he said in a tone that suggested it was not a serious allegation at all. It's an observation, I said. The allegation is for other people to make. I lowered the document, and then I turned slightly to my left and looked at the corner of the barn. Owen Calloway stepped out of the shadow. He moved slowly the way he'd moved in the underground room, with the careful deliberateness of a man who has spent 4 months conserving his physical resources and has learned to make every movement intentional. He came to stand beside me in the gravel yard, and the moonlight fell across his face, and Richard Voss looked at him. The silence that followed was of a different kind than the one before it. I have tried in the time since that night to find the precise language for what I saw on Voss's face. In the moment he recognized Owen Calloway standing alive in the yard of a property he had spent 26 years trying to acquire. The closest I can come is this: it was the expression of a man whose entire model of the world has just been revised at its foundation, and who is intelligent enough to understand immediately what that revision means for everything built on top of it. He went very still, not the controlled stillness of before, a different kind, the stillness of a man whose stillness is all he has left. Owen looked at Voss for a long moment without speaking. There was nothing theatrical about it, no satisfaction in his face, no anger, no performance of any of the emotions the situation might have invited. He simply looked at the man who had spent a quarter century making his life impossible, with the steady directness of someone who has had a great deal of time to prepare for this and has decided that simplicity is more powerful than drama. Then Owen looked at Barrett. Barrett had not moved since Owen appeared. He was standing near his truck with his hands still in his jacket pockets and his face doing something I had not seen it do in all the hours I had spent with him over the past 2 days. The careful composure was gone entirely. What was underneath it was something rawer and more honest and considerably more painful to look at. He was looking at Owen the way a man looks at something he believed he had destroyed and has just discovered is still standing. Voss found his voice. "This changes nothing," he said, and his voice was controlled, but the control was costing him now audibly. "The legal mechanism is already in motion. The document is filed. Whatever you think you can demonstrate about Richard." Owen's voice was quiet, not loud enough to be dramatic, just loud enough to stop Voss's sentence. "I've been recording your calls for 4 months." The yard was very still. "Every conversation with your attorney about the contract, every conversation with your geological team about the revised deposit assessment, every conversation with the intermediary you used to approach Barrett." Owen paused. "The equipment in the tunnel has been transmitting and logging since June. I have everything." Voss said nothing. The third figure near the Range Rover had gone very still as well. I watched Voss process this. Watch the intelligence behind those pale blue eyes, work through it with the speed of a man who has navigated complicated situations for 40 years and knows how to assess a position quickly. He was looking for the exit, the angle that remained viable, the thread that, if pulled correctly, might still allow him to extract something from a situation that had shifted catastrophically in the last 3 minutes. I could see the moment he thought he found one. He looked at Barrett, and the specific quality of how he looked at Barrett, calculating, expectant, the look of a man who believes he still holds a card, told me everything I needed to know about what Voss thought the relationship between them still was. "Barrett," he said in a tone that was almost gentle, almost collegial, the tone of a man reminding another man of the nature of their arrangement. We should discuss next steps privately. Barrett did not move. He was still looking at Owen, not at Voss, not at me, not at the document in my hand or the third figure near the Range Rover or anything else in the gravel yard. Just at Owen with that raw, painful honesty that had replaced his careful composure. Barrett? Voss's voice was slightly less gentle this time. Nora's next treatment cycle begins in 3 weeks. It was precisely the wrong thing to say. I understood this the moment he said it, and I think Owen understood it too, because I saw something shift very slightly in my father's face, a readiness, a waiting as if he had known this was the moment and had been holding space for it. Barrett Holt turned his head and looked at Richard Voss. The look lasted about 2 seconds, long enough to be deliberate, long enough to communicate something that did not require words, though what it communicated I could not have precisely named. It was the look of a man at the end of a very long and specific kind of exhaustion, the kind that comes not from physical depletion, but from the sustained effort of being someone you are, not in service of something that cost you the thing you most needed to preserve. Then Barrett reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. His hand was steady. I noticed that. After everything, the months of it, the weight of what he had done and what he had failed to do and what it had cost him to do, even the small corrective thing he'd managed in March, his hand on the phone was completely steady. He dialed 911. He brought the phone to his ear and stood straight in the gravel yard in the moonlight, and when the dispatcher answered, he spoke clearly without hesitation in the unadorned, factual language of a man who has decided that the only thing he has left to offer is the plain truth delivered without decoration. My name is Barrett Holt. I am at the Caldwell farm on County Road 7 in Creston Valley, Idaho. I need to report ongoing federal crimes. I am a witness and a participant, and I am prepared to make a full statement. The individual primarily responsible is Richard Voss, CEO of Voss Energy Partners, and he is currently on the property with me. He lowered the phone slightly and looked at Voss. Voss had not moved. His face was still composed, but the composure had become something else now, not a tool, not a professional resource, but the only remaining shelter of a man who has run out of ground and is standing in it as the last available position. He said, "You have just destroyed everything I could have done for your daughter." Barrett's jaw tightened, a single visible contraction. Then he said quietly to Voss, the words I have turned over many times since, because they contain in their particular economy the whole moral weight of what he had lived through. I already destroyed it the night I took your first phone call. I destroyed it. A pause. I've just been too afraid to admit that until right now. He brought the phone back to his ear and continued giving the dispatcher the details she needed. Voss turned and looked at the third figure near the Range Rover, some quick, silent communication passing between them. The third figure reached for something. I saw Owen take a step forward, but it wasn't necessary, because Sybil Crane's headlights came around the bend in the county road at that exact moment, and behind her headlights were 2 more sets unmarked vehicles moving quickly on the gravel, and even before they stopped in the yard I could see the figures getting out with the particular purposeful efficiency of people who have been waiting in position and have just received the signal they were waiting for. The FBI had been less than 2 miles away. Sybil had told them the triggering event would happen tonight. She had told them to wait for her call, and she had called them from the farmhouse while Barrett and Voss were in the yard, and I was presumably asleep, which was what they had both believed. She came across the yard toward me with her leather briefcase and her iron gray hair and her flat practical boots, and she looked at me with those sharp dark eyes and said simply, "You did well." "My father did well," I said. "I just showed up." She considered this. "You showed up alone," she said, "at 2 a.m, into a 30-foot well. That is not nothing." She had a point. The next several hours were the organized chaos of law enforcement operating efficiently in a small space. Agents processed the yard and then the farmhouse, and then with Owen's guidance, the tunnel and the underground room where the recording equipment was photographed and catalogued in place before being carefully removed. Voss and the third figure were separated and taken to different vehicles. The third figure, it turned out, was a private security contractor from Denver with a prior record that made his presence at a rural Idaho farm in the middle of the night deeply uncomplicated to explain. Barrett was handcuffed and placed in the back of a separate vehicle. He did not resist. He did not protest. He sat in the back of the car with his hands in his lap, and through the vehicle's window as I walked past, I saw him looking at the farmhouse with an expression I recognized from my father's face in the underground room. The expression of a man who has been carrying something alone and has finally, at great cost, set it down. I stopped at the window. He looked at me when I knocked softly on the glass. I didn't know what I intended to say. I hadn't thought past the knock. But when his eyes met mine through the glass, what came out was not the anger I might have expected from myself or the condemnation the situation arguably warranted. What came out was Nora. He blinked. "I'll make sure someone calls about Nora," I said, "tonight, so she knows where you are." His face did something then that I am not going to try to describe precisely, because some things are private even when they happen in plain sight, even when you witness them fully. He nodded once very carefully and looked back at the farmhouse. I walked away. Sybil found me an hour later standing at the edge of the gravel yard where the field began, looking out at the moonlit land. She stood beside me without speaking for a moment, which I appreciated. "The recording equipment," I said, "everything on it, will be processed by the Bureau," she said. "It's substantial. 4 months of documented communication constitutes an extremely robust evidentiary record. Voss's attorney is already attempting to argue privilege on some of the recorded conversations, but given that several of them involve the planning of what amounts to criminal conspiracy, the privilege argument is not going to survive contact with a federal judge." The forged contract. The forensic document unit will confirm the signature discrepancy within a matter of weeks. I have an independent examiner who has already reviewed it under preliminary engagement and is prepared to testify. Combined with the recording in which Voss's attorney discusses the contract's construction, the forgery is not going to be difficult to establish. The mineral rights remain entirely with you, Sybil said. The surface title is clear. The attempted claim was fraudulent. Once the court order Voss filed is vacated, which it will be, there is no competing claim of any legal standing. I looked out at the fields. $4 to $7 billion, the geological contractor had said on the recording, in the high concentration section directly beneath the Caldwell farm. I thought about Frances Caldwell, who had lived here 50 years and died without knowing what was under her ground. I thought about a distant nephew in Pennsylvania who had taken the first reasonable offer and never looked back. I thought about $14,000 borrowed against a retirement account paid by a man who rented a room in Boise for the next 26 years and paid taxes on a property he never lived in with money I still didn't fully understand the source of. "The tuition," I said to Sybil. She was quiet for a moment. "The geological survey data," she said carefully. "Your father retained copies of the original fieldwork, the complete subsurface mapping. Voss had the corporate version, which he'd filed under proprietary research, but Owen had his own field notebooks, his own core sample analysis, his own elevation and electromagnetic data. He couldn't use it publicly. The non-disclosure agreement prevented that, but it had value in certain private arrangements to people who understood what they were looking at. He sold copies of his own field data," I said, "selectively, carefully, over a period of years, to parties who had no connection to Voss and no interest in the Creston Valley property specifically. just the methodology, the analytical approach. It was a careful line to walk legally, and Sibyl, I reviewed each arrangement to ensure it stayed on the right side of the NDA's actual language rather than Voss's preferred interpretation of it. She paused. It generated enough over time to cover what he needed to cover. I thought about that for a while, about a man generating income from the intellectual product of his own work that had been taken from him in the only way still available to him, and using that income to pay for his daughter's education at a school that trained people to understand the invisible architecture of structures. The irony was almost too neat. Almost. Owen found me just before dawn. The federal agents had finished their initial processing, and the yard had quieted to a residual activity. A single vehicle remaining, 2 agents inside the farmhouse completing documentation. The gravel was marked with tire tracks from the night's traffic, and the barn stood in the first grey suggestion of morning light with its familiar slight lean into the prevailing wind. Owen came across the yard slowly. He had a cup of coffee in each hand. The farmhouse kitchen had been released back to habitable use, and he held one out toward me as he reached the field's edge. I took it. We stood together for a while without speaking, the way people stand together when there is too much to say and the dawn is coming and there will be time soon to begin saying all of it. The fields were changing color as the light shifted. The silver of the moonlit night giving way to a deeper gold, the dry autumn grass warming from the east as the sky above the hills began to pale. The land moved in the morning breeze in those slow, patient waves, the same waves I had watched from the gravel yard yesterday afternoon when I first arrived, when the property was still just a legal abstraction and my father was still just a recently dead man I had never known. I owe you 22 years of explanation, Owen said. You gave me a substantial portion of it tonight, I said. The substantial portion that makes me look necessary rather than simply absent, he said. There's a difference. I considered this. It was, I thought, the most honest thing he had said. Yes, I said, there is. The light continued to change. Below us, below the earth, we were standing on the mineral deposit, sat in its geological silence, the lithium and cobalt and rare earth elements that had accumulated over millions of years in the specific way that rock accumulates things when given sufficient time and pressure. Indifferent to the human drama that had organized itself above it for the past 26 years. Indifferent to Francis Caldwell and Richard Voss and 14,000 borrowed dollars and a sealed envelope and an iron key, and a daughter who had driven to Idaho believing she was settling an estate and had instead found the living center of the secret her father had built his entire adult life around. I don't want to mine it, I said. Owen turned his head to look at me. I don't want to extract it, I said. I don't want to sell the rights to someone who will. I've spent enough time in this business watching what development does to ground, what extraction does to the landscape above and below the surface, to know what that land looks like in 10 years if someone industrializes it. Owen was quiet. There are clean energy companies, I said. Serious ones, the kind that have third-party environmental oversight built into their operational structure, not bolted on afterward. The kind that would accept a licensing agreement with genuine land stewardship requirements as a condition. I turned to look at him. We retain the title, we retain the surface, we negotiate the extraction parameters with a company we choose, with conditions we set, with a monitoring structure we control. That's a complicated legal and commercial arrangement to construct, Owen said. I know a good attorney, I said. He looked at me for a moment. Then something happened on his face that I recognized after a beat as the thing that precedes a smile in a man who doesn't smile easily, or often a particular softening around the eyes, a loosening of something that is usually held in place. Sybil will want to negotiate the terms herself, he said. She has opinions about licensing structures. She can have them, I said. She's earned them. We were quiet again. The first direct light came over the eastern hills and caught the tops of the tall grass and moved through the field in a slow wave from east to west, the kind of light that makes you understand why people have always found a religious meaning in mourning. Behind us, the farmhouse held its long, weathered shape against the sky. The barn leaned its familiar lean. I thought about the work it would take, the legal proceedings, months of them, possibly years before the full weight of what had been documented came to rest in its final institutional form. The conversation with the FBI that was scheduled for later that morning and the many conversations after it. The question of what happened to Barrett Holt, who had done a terrible thing and then at the last possible moment done the right one, and whose daughter was 24 years old and sick in a hospital in Spokane. I thought about what I would do about Nora. I had told Barrett I would call about her tonight and I would, but the question of what came after that phone call was larger and I hadn't resolved it yet. I understood that resolving it would require sitting with the full complexity of what Barrett had done, the betrayal and the warning and the 5 months of feeding information to a man who intended to have Owen killed, and then the 3 sentences on an anonymous notepad that had given Owen the window he needed. I understood that complexity was not a reason to withhold judgment indefinitely, but it was a reason to be careful about how judgment was rendered. Some things deserve more than a simple verdict. I thought about my mother in Portland, who did not know any of this and would need to, who had spent 22 years maintaining a careful silence about a man she had apparently known well enough to protect her daughter from his situation, whether or not she had known the full dimension of it. That conversation was going to be its own undertaking. I thought about Seattle, about my drafting table and the 3-hour deadline I had been ignoring when the phone rang on Tuesday afternoon, about the building under construction outside my window and the worker who had been standing still on the platform looking at something I couldn't see. I thought about load-bearing walls, about the invisible geometry that keeps things standing when everything around them wants to fall, about what it means to build something that is meant to last. Owen put his coffee cup down on the fence rail at the field's edge and turned to look at me directly. I know that what I did, he said, cannot be addressed adequately in a single conversation or several. I know that whatever I explain, the 22 years are a fact that explanation cannot undo. I am not going to ask you to forgive something on a timeline that suits me. He stopped, looked out at the field. But I want you to know one thing, not as an excuse, just as a fact you should have. He paused. Every year, every single year that I kept this distance, I asked myself whether it was still necessary, whether the calculus had changed, whether the danger had reduced enough to allow something different. I asked it every year. I looked at the side of his face, the gray hair, the scar above the eyebrow, the particular set of his jaw that I realized I had seen in my own face in mirrors and had never known where it came from. And I said, and every year, he said, I concluded that the risk was still real, which may be true, and which may also be the conclusion a man arrives at when he has told himself a story for long enough that the story and the fear have become indistinguishable. He turned and looked at me. I don't know even now which one it was. Both, probably. In proportions, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to honestly assess. I held my coffee cup in both hands and felt the warmth of it. This was, I thought, the most honest thing a person could offer. Not the clean narrative of sacrifice and necessity, not the story that makes the absence make sense in the way that allows everyone to feel resolved. Just the admission that the truth is probably a combination of things in proportions that may never be fully determined, delivered by a man willing to sit with that uncertainty rather than bury it under a better story. I was an architect. I understood imperfect structures. I understood that some buildings stand for 100 years, not because they were perfectly designed, but because they were honestly built with the flaws accounted for the stress points, identified the weak joints, reinforced rather than hidden. Honesty in structures is more durable than perfection. I'm not leaving today, I said. Owen was quiet. I booked a return flight for Sunday, I said. That gives us 3 days before I have to be back in Seattle. 3 days is not 22 years, but it's a beginning if you want it to be. The sun was fully above the eastern hills now, and the light across the field was clear and direct in the way that early morning light in open country is clear without the haze of the city, without the compression of buildings and streets that gives urban light its particular quality. Out here, the light came straight from the horizon and traveled across the ground, and you could see it moving. Owen Calloway looked out at 92 acres of land he had protected for 26 years and which now belonged to his daughter, and which held beneath it a deposit of minerals worth more than either of us would ever fully need, and which sat in the morning light of an Idaho autumn with the patient, indifferent beauty of things that have been here much longer than the people standing in them and will be here long after. I wanted to be, he said. I nodded. We stood together on the edge of the field and watched the light move across the ground, and for a while there was nothing that needed to be said that hadn't been said, and nothing that needed to be done that couldn't wait until the morning had finished arriving and the land stretched away from us in every direction, quiet and full and entirely permanently ours.